Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Yeah, you can tell the 2024 primary season is well underway. I had already told you that California Governor Gavin Newsom has been testing the waters for a presidential campaign ever since he launched a broadside attack on moron DeSantis last year. Newsom certainly picked his moment well. If the Democrats are going to change horses in mid-stride, they better pick a good one. The Republicans' performative fascism certainly cost them elections last year, but with the economy not showing any signs of improving, Biden might be out of luck if the Democrats decide that he's the horse that's going to carry them to glory a second time. Newsom is younger than Biden, it would be hard to find someone older, and he is governor of the nation's largest state. As a result, he already is known and liked by a number of influential Democratic leaders, strategists, and donors on both coasts. Though for him, his big vulnerability is going to be that Republicans will be saying that California, San Francisco in particular, is overrun with crime. And on the Democratic side of the ledger, you're going to be having the party base asking, why is the rent so freaking high and why aren't you doing anything about it? Newsom doesn't have any real strikes against him, at least nothing in terms of scandal. He's not polarizing and alienating like DeSantis. And he also doesn't carry some of the baggage like Joe Biden, though whether or not someone can dig up dirt on him remains to be seen. He's a blank slate largely. He can pull the same political con game that Obama did. Of all the Democratic hopefuls for 2024, I'm sure Newsom will be the most charming when he smiles and tells us that he can't do anything for us. No tangibles, no legislation to punish people who harm us, nothing. He'll get the velvet glove treatment from the white media and from bootlicking Negroes like the kind you find on white-owned radio and TV stations, who will make certain not to pin him down with any specific campaign promises for us. And he'll smile as he dances around any and all demands that he do something for black people. I'm sure that he's even now planning some private dinners with some black leaders in Atlanta or DC or New York so he can get them to stand behind him like props and say, this is our candidate. Same as another Democratic politician, Mike Bloomberg, did a couple of years back. And just in case the occasional rogue element does manage to get through the white media and bootlick filter and actually confront him, you can bet he's going to pull out Bruce's Beach as his shield to ward off any and all criticism and any and all demands. Though of interest is, I don't see the white media taking any potshots at him or giving reasons why it would be a bad idea for Gavin Newsom to run for president. So obviously, people are looking at Joe Biden and going, man, it's a miracle he made it this far. Do we really want to cross our fingers and hope that he can pull that rabbit out of a hat twice? Obviously, Newsom is looked at as being a favorable alternative to Biden and a fair sight better than Kamala Harris. So that's what I think about Gavin Newsom's pending presidential announcement. But he's not the only one throwing his Burger King crown in the ring. Robert Kennedy Jr., part of the Kennedy clan, he's also saying that he wants to run for president. Some of you have posted comments or sent me messages asking me what do I think about Robert Kennedy Jr. Now, before I get to the things that he's said and positions that I'm sure make some of your hearts go pitter-pat, I think now would be a good time to refresh your memory about the Kennedys because neither John Kennedy nor Robert Kennedy did anything for black people. That's just a fact. They both allowed J. Edgar Hoover to spy on Dr. King and others in the civil rights movement, and they did nothing while Hoover and his minions sent fraudulent letters claiming that Dr. King was some sort of adulterer. You had John Kennedy, who was the president, and Robert Kennedy, who was his attorney general, and they didn't do anything about J. Edgar Hoover, even though Robert Kennedy was over J. Edgar Hoover. So what does that tell you? When you look at how they acted towards the civil rights movement, you see the Kennedy brothers were not all that bothered at all about what J. Edgar Hoover was doing against the civil rights movement, against American law-abiding citizens. You have to wonder if maybe he was doing it at their behest. On a side note, for decades now we've had white supremacists and their agents push the lie that Dr. King was sleeping around. It's been 55 years since his death and 70 years since he began his political crusade. In 3/4 of a century, nobody's produced a single bit of evidence to prop up the lie about King being some sort of philanderer. I, in particular, have been hearing the occasional white supremacist telling me that the FBI has recordings of Dr. King since at least the early 1990s. Some of you listening to me probably can recall it earlier than that. People claiming that the FBI has incriminating recordings of Dr. King at some hotel with some strange woman, and these people claim that they have heard these alleged recordings. But when you ask them if they can produce any of them, they tell you that they don't actually have any copies of these alleged recordings, but they heard it from somebody, or they had some friend who let them listen to them, and take their word for it, it totally happened. And they also tell you that one day the FBI records on Dr. King will finally be opened, and everyone will get to see what a moral fraud he was. And it's been 30 plus years and I'm still waiting. Dr. King was assassinated 55 years ago. The U.S. government released its sealed report about the Kennedy assassination some years back, though I think we can all agree that any records about that were scrubbed clean a long time ago. But why is it that all this alleged proof these white supremacists keep claiming exists about Dr. King has never seen the light of day in any shape, form, or fashion? No photographs, no film reels, no audio, not even a fingerprint. Absolutely nothing. If there was any evidence, wouldn't Fox News be running it morning, noon, and night? Wouldn't every right-wing hate radio station be playing the incriminating audio of Dr. King round the clock? Wouldn't every white supremacist organization and mouthpiece from Stormfront to Ben Shapiro to Breitbart be playing it and spreading it nonstop? And if it did exist, wouldn't there be some quote-unquote whistleblower who leaked it? Wouldn't there be some tabloid putting it out there? But instead, nothing. In 55 years since Dr. King's assassination, nobody's produced a scintilla of evidence about these alleged recordings. There's more evidence of Bigfoot than there is evidence that Dr. King was sleeping around. I'm not joking on that one, by the way. At least with Bigfoot, there's a few questionable photos and an alleged video. With these slanderous lies about Dr. King, they don't even have that much. And you want to know why? Because that lie was a COINTELPRO operation by J. Edgar Hoover. Dr. King and the civil rights movement's strength was that they successfully framed their movement as a moral movement. And they skillfully and clearly defined who were the good guys and who were the bad guys. The white supremacists like J. Edgar Hoover didn't like the fact that they had been exposed, and more importantly than that, people were being told who and what these white supremacists were, and that they have to take a side. Nobody wants to side with someone who is clearly immoral, and Dr. King showed the world how immoral America is, especially its government. Hoover and his pals seethed about this. They raged about it. How Dr. King was eroding their public support and their very ability to exist. They determined that they had to do something to counter Dr. King's moral reputation. The man wasn't rich, so they couldn't claim that he had been hoarding money or living lavishly. He was even-tempered, so they couldn't claim he had been abusive to anyone. He regarded all people as his equals, so they couldn't claim he was a secret anti-Semite. So what was there? The cardinal lie that this country has always pushed about black men, that black men are all rapists or at the very least cannot control themselves sexually. So the FBI started a whisper campaign against Dr. King on that basis, and there was no shortage of white supremacists in the government or the white media who were willing to spread that lie, and even some people who the FBI had planted inside of these civil rights organizations that Dr. King worked with. Hoover had bootlicking agents like Elder Lightfoot Michaud, who was on the take for the FBI. Michaud had the empty-headed congregants of his church, go so far as to demonstrate against Dr. King for what I'm not sure. And of course the white media would be there to report on that and say, here's black people who are opposing King. See, he's not as popular as you thought. And the white media, Michaud, and the FBI all knew these so-called protests against King were not grassroots at all. They were pure astroturf. J. Edgar Hoover was the one who put the battery in Michaud's back. I bring that up to underscore the point that if Hoover had this sorry pulpit pimp on his payroll lying about Dr. King, what makes you think that Hoover also didn't have other Negro turncoats who were doing the same thing? The FBI had all of these civil rights groups thoroughly infiltrated. They had entire infestations of FBI informants. From Malcolm to Martin to Fred Hampton, every black figure of note back then always had a few FBI operatives around them. And some of these operatives did more than just go back to the FBI and tattle about whatever it is that might have been said behind closed doors. Many of them were willing to lie for the FBI in order to help fabricate cases against the civil rights movement. Many of them were being paid by the FBI. I want you to remember that fact whenever some fool tries to say, well, I heard that some friend of Dr. King said it was true. The point of this whisper campaign by the FBI was to undermine the moral legitimacy of the civil rights movement and the changes it was bringing about. The U.S. government had done this successfully in other countries and inside the U.S. before the 60s, so they figured it should be pretty straightforward to impugn Dr. King's moral character and as a result undermine the movement. But they failed. Though among the racist, the malicious, and the just plain stupid, this urban myth about the adulterous Dr. King has had its fans, people who know that there's no evidence, but since you can't call Dr. King the N-word, they push this lie instead, which is the entire point. But I digress. My point is, I'm not going to make any avowals about the morality, ethics, or character of Robert Kennedy Jr. It doesn't take much imagination to figure out this guy is cut from the same cloth as his famous forebears. He's offering us nothing new. Well, hell, I could have just stopped at saying he's offering us nothing and that would have been sufficient. Though it seems he's not going to be getting very far. The white media is already calling him an anti-vaxxer, and that's usually the kiss of death these days. And they're framing him as some sort of conspiracy theorist because he says that the Fed intends to get rid of Bitcoin in order to clear the way for their own digital currency. Now, some of you, for whatever reason, seem to be supportive of, or at the very least sympathetic to Robert Kennedy Jr., and I'm not really sure why. Look, I'm not saying that in order to be acceptable as a candidate, you gotta come out the gate screaming B1 and that they're here to tear down white supremacy. That would be nice, but it's not required. Though what is required is that anyone who wants our vote acknowledge that black people have unique and different needs separate and apart from other groups, that we have been systematically impoverished beyond any other group, and we have been kept this way as a result of deliberate policy, both governmental and business, and that the would-be candidate is going to move tangible resources, starting with but not limited to money, into our hands, directly into our hands, to correct this. Do you hear even a hint of that from this guy? I don't want phony sympathy. All I care about is, what are you going to do for us? If you want to support this guy, don't you think he ought to be telling us what he intends to do? Because if he isn't, that means he's not going to do anything. And on the funny page, I hear Tim Scott's planning a presidential run too. By the way, doesn't Tim Scott look like Jesse Lee Peterson's stunt double? I'm just saying. Years ago, he admitted that he had been racially profiled by police, but I don't think that's going to be part of his stump speech when he goes in front of those GOP crowds. And no, without anything even approaching saying what he's going to do for us, it makes no sense to vote for any Republican. That guy is not very bright, which explains perfectly why you had all those white supremacists in South Carolina who have no problem voting for him. Though with all of this culture war going on, chances are these same white supremacists who don't like seeing books about black history ain't going to be too keen on voting for a black candidate. But at least it'll give Tim Scott and Clarence Thomas something they can talk about while they're busy cleaning tables and handing mint juleps to their white supremacist paymasters at the country club. I'm gonna need my people to get over this idea that we have friends somewhere. We don't. Yes, the Democrats have been lying for decades, but so are the Republicans. Any fool who thinks that we need to be talking ourselves into allying with either party is just too foolish for this movement. And let's be honest, when black people say allies, what we really mean is friends. We want other people to be our friends. Well, let me tell you something. Black Americans are a group, and groups don't have friends. Groups have interests. To put it in election terms, groups have issues. So what issues are you about? From my vantage point, to the extent the Republicans are making themselves a quote-unquote threat to democracy, Democrats don't seem too bothered by it. They can't seem to get themselves motivated to do anything other than lament the death of civility in American politics. If Democrats were to actually make it a point to use the offices that they currently hold to put pressure on these right-wing nuts, they would be gone. But we all know that's not their goal. Both parties are in the business of getting money from big donors. And while it's true that the Republican Party is undoubtedly the party of mental illness now, that doesn't mean the Democrats should or could get our vote automatically by default. Remember, the goal is not for us to change our minds or to compromise on what we need just so that we can have someone to vote for. It is up to them to change their platforms to suit us, not the other way around. We cannot fall into the trap of following cults of personality or hype trains. Politicians, and especially political parties, have become experts at getting people excited for no reason. We have a lot of shills, agents, and political operatives among us who come around saying that we have to vote for someone. Well, whomever you vote for better be willing to say what they're going to do for you. Otherwise, the only thing you're actually voting for is nothing. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Ray Fitzpatrick, Samantha Ellis, Suleiman Alaji, Sherman Marshall, and Rowlett Churchwell. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.